Okay, so far we've kind of mentioned discussing the French and Indian War and how that war becomes kind of an eventual leap towards the American Revolution, but there's going to be a series of other things that kind of spawn or create this desire for revolution in the United States, or what becomes the United States, formerly the colony. So we'll talk about that and kind of get to detail and see some of those underlying themes that kind of lead to that event. Okay, unfortunately, this is kind of cut off, but there is a sense of deep roots of the revolution. So in a broad sense, as it mentions here, we were coming to the colonies leaving England, at least when you look at New England. A lot of those people, as we know, were separatists coming to America to form a new colony under new religious beliefs because they didn't necessarily get along with the ideas of England. And there's also going to be some poor people who come to the American colonies for perhaps economic opportunities or social elevation, things like that. So early on, we kind of got this early sense of an independence. We're thousands of miles away, so some of those things have kind of separated us, and we've become more and more independent over time in the sense of ideology. But we still will remain partially dependent on them because of the mercantilistic ideas that were being spread at that point. We'll look at those a little bit further, but just kind of understand that idea that there were some deep roots of revolution kind of starting at the very early parts. Okay, so as I just mentioned, mercantilism becomes kind of one of the major economic uses or devices at this point. So of the 13 original colonies, only Georgia was the one that was formally planted by the British government. Other ones were created by joint stock companies, religious groups, and so forth, and land speculators, and even some of these groups, as we know, like Maryland would have been a religious group, and then you have these proprietary colonies like Pennsylvania that were established as well. But most of it was dealing on the ideas of mercantilism. So a country's economic wealth was measured by the amount of gold and silver in its treasury. And to get more and more of that in your treasury is to export more than you import, which is known as a favorable balance of trade. So you would like to export more items than import, which means you're less dependent on foreign nations, and your treasury is growing as that kind of develops. So you need to have colonies, and colonies are there to provide the raw materials so you don't buy those from other colonies. So those colonies provide raw materials, they send them to the mother country, and then they're turned into finished goods and sold elsewhere, sometimes back to the colonies, making a decent profit. So this meant basically we're sending all of our stuff on British ships. So the British merchant trade was very strong at this point because they have a monopoly using the colonies for raw materials, and they're transported on these English ships, and then they're sold elsewhere, oftentimes taxed and so forth. So it mentions here also they had to grow tobacco and sugar for the English. They can't buy it, or they could have otherwise bought it from other countries, but they're not supposed to. So as a result of this, it said it severely handcuffs American trade, so that we're only supposed to be trading with England, especially on certain items. So they have a monopoly there. So to kind of enforce this idea, they passed a series of navigation laws in the 1650s, mainly aimed at Dutch shippers to try and target them. They restricted commerce from the colonies to England. That's the only places they're supposed to be doing it, to only use English ships and no other. So it would cripple, hopefully, they hoped, the Dutch. But over time, they didn't really do very much about this. They're supposed to be collecting duties on these things, which are taxes, basically, and showing the proof that they've paid them. And they had products such as enumerated goods could only be shipped to England. So they're only supposed to be doing that. They couldn't even really manufacture their own things. So the wool and cloth industry, oftentimes all those manufacturing was going on in England, so we weren't able to do that ourselves, so we're dependent on them for finished products. We have no currency. We eventually start printing more of it, which causes inflation, and it depreciates the value of that. But things were basically being bought from England, so all of our money was exported to England, and very few items were being sent back here. And when they were being sent back to here, they were finished products and they cost more money. So colonial laws could be voided by a privy council. That was one way of doing it. Used very sparingly. Still, colonists were infuriated by its use and all this kind of stuff of regulation. So we typically despise these navigation laws, but they're not really strictly enforced until after 1763. Because of that, we, as in England, needed to raise money and revenue to fight or pay for the war that they just fought with the French and Indian / 7 Years' War that ended in 1763. So after this, there's going to be basically a rise in smuggling because of the lack of enforcement due to salutary neglect. That's the idea that England just kind of let us be doing our own thing for quite some time, and then eventually called us out and said, hey, you need to start paying taxes or were actually enforcing these new laws, or these laws that have been on the books since 1650, known as the navigation laws. So it mentions there John Hancock makes a lot of money from smuggling. They have a monopoly on the British market. And as it results here, Americans had unusual opportunity of self-government. We were doing pretty well up until they start restricting some of these things. They have the strongest military in the world backing us, and we're not paying for it. So basically, the Americans had it made. Even repressive laws weren't enforced very much at this point, and the average American benefited much more than the average Englishman. In England, they were paying heavier taxes and expected more support from their citizens rather than the colonists. So a lot of this isn't done out of punishment. It's just done to enforce and keep the government running. It later becomes punishment. So as I alluded before, after Britain began to enforce mercantilism in 1763, this is what really angered the American colonists. Now, the fuse is lit for the American Revolution. Some disadvantages: Americans couldn't buy, sell, ship, or manufacture under those most favorable conditions. They can't just send it to anybody. So the markets are pretty limited, but they've got a strong market at this point. The South, which produced crops that weren't grown in England, was preferred over the North. So the South still, had a market and a desire there. Virginia grew tobacco at the mercy of British buyers, though, and often paid very poor prices in responding for putting many planters into debt. So sometimes they felt like they were at the desires of the British with the markets. They couldn't sell it elsewhere. And as a result of that, some colonists felt that Britain was just milking her colonies for all they were worth and using them as much as possible, and sometimes abusing them. And Roosevelt apparently had a quote about revolution broke out because England failed to recognize that we were basically a new emerging nation, that we were going to be strong and so forth. But we knew it. So a lot of this goes back to paying debts, some of this uproar that's going to happen. So the stamp tax will be initiated. So after the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War, there's a huge debt that's still sitting there. And though it not fairly had no intention of making the Americans pay it all off for Britain, did feel Americans should pay at least a third of the cost. So we're only paying a third of this, since basically they had allowed and protected the Americans. So it's George Grenville, who is the prime minister at this point, ordered the navigation laws be enforced, and that caused a lot of resentment to begin with. They secured a Sugar Act in 1764, which increased the duty on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies, so it would make it more expensive for us to get French, maybe, to entice us to buying English. And any time we bought French sugar, maybe, that money would be used to help pay off some of that debt. Eventually, those duties will reduce, though, and then you have the Quartering Act, which was initiated in 1765, required certain colonies to provide food and quarters for British troops. Not necessarily going to be private quartering, but later on we're going to see that after the coercive acts are passed, or intolerable acts, that actually will be a more definitive quartering act. So we'll get to that later on in 1774, but we'll hold off for right now. So in 1765, they put the stamp tax to raise money for the new military force, and there's going to be a military presence, but they're also helping pay off some of those debts that they had incurred from the French and Indian War. It mandated that the use of stamp paper or fixed stamps certifying that you had paid this tax. So pretty much any document that had any documentation supposed to have this stamp on it. Required on bills of sale, 50 trade items, commercial and legal documents, provided for offenders to be tried in admiralty courts where defenders were guilty until proven innocent, which really angered people. And also over time, Grenville felt these taxes were fair, so wasn't any point in that. It's just actually asking the colonists to pay their share of the deal, plus the English are still paying much heavier tax, and eventually we'll see that this is going to be repealed, but it's not going to be repealed in England. The Americans argued that they were unfairly taxed because it's an unnecessary army. The reason why are they here? And they lashed out very violently against the stamp and sometimes used force. They cried the ideas early on of no taxation without representation. They thought it was pretty much the idea and the principle at hand. And they denied the right of Parliament to tax Americans, since no Americans were actually seated in Parliament, and that's where that idea of no taxation without representation keeps going. But the British used what they call virtual representation. They said that Parliament represents all British subjects, so even when you don't have a representative in Parliament, they're still thinking of you when they pass this legislation. Kind of like you as maybe a teenager aren't 18, But when government officials, congressmen pass legislation, they think about you, but you can't vote for them directly, and you don't have representation through them directly. So that's kind of a way of remembering that as well. So the idea of virtual representation, that they're doing this to virtually represent all people that are English subjects. So eventually, this kind of gets to a heated point where in 1765, representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies meet in New York City to discuss the Stamp Act. They form what is known as the Stamp Act Congress. Britain pretty much primarily ignores it, as it mentions here, but it is another step towards colonial or intercolonial unity, kind of like we saw with the Albany Congress. Although it didn't work during the French and Indian War, it's a step towards it. There's going to be boycotts used oftentimes. So instead, they start making their own items instead of buying British ones. Sometimes they made their own cloth. An example of some groups that led these movements were the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, especially the Sons of Liberty. They really took things into their hands and became violent and tarred and feathered violators who didn't follow up with the boycott. Oftentimes, the Daughters of Liberty were having spinning parties where they would get women together to spin their own cloth, where they wouldn't buy British cloth or make their own tea or something like that. So they also stormed houses of important officials and took their money and things like that. Parliament eventually starts to look at this, and they repeal the Stamp Act. And it basically keeps going, as I mentioned before, in England, but it is repealed in the colonies. So in 1766, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act. They pass what is known as the Declaratory Act, which said that Parliament had the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So basically, they're just trying to show, again, their power to do certain things, and that they may be repealing this, but they're not giving in, because it's now becoming a power struggle on the rights and powers that exist between colonies and the mother country, or England. Okay, another series of acts or taxes will be passed again. They're known as the Townshend Acts that get passed. Apparently he was a drunk, but persuaded Parliament to pass the Townshend Acts in 1767. They're a little bit different. The stamp tax was mainly on documents. This is going to be a light tax on lead, paint, paper, tea, and all of them are going to be repealed except for the tea. And the reason that the tea stays there is kind of like that Declaratory Act. It's to show that not only do they have the right to do this, but they have the power to tax, and they will use that power. So in 1767, the legislature of New York was suspended for failure to comply with the Quartering Act. Tea's being smuggled, as we know, when there is a black market, will exist. It's difficult to enforce this, so eventually troops are going to go be sent in to have more of a presence to start enforcing some of these things. And on March 5th, 1770, there's a group of people who get together in Boston and start harassing some redcoats, which were the British soldiers who were stationed there. Apparently it gets out of hand. Somebody gets hit with a club, one of the British officials or soldiers. Snowballs are being thrown. There's not any orders ever given to fire, but eventually they fire upon what are considered to be innocent citizens, although innocent in the sense of they were throwing ice, rocks, and oyster shells. That's probably not that innocent. And then they ended up killing some individuals because of the chaos that ensued. Crispus Attucks is one of the first deaths, you could say, of the American Revolution, or during the Boston Massacre. Excuse me. And only 2 of the redcoats are going to be prosecuted for this. So people feel as if the British are getting away with whatever they want at this point, and not being actually formally charged for what they're doing. So this becomes a kind of going to be used as propaganda, as the name entitles there, Boston Massacre. That sounds like innocent Americans were attacked and were unarmed. In reality, they probably were armed, and they didn't deserve being shot and fired upon, but they were provoked and felt as if they were defending themselves, the English soldiers. And we'll look at a clip from that. So go ahead and watch this clip about John Adams and his actions and reactions during the Boston Massacre.
Allow the child to breathe.
Can you breathe now?
Did you go to the farm?
Yeah. Mr. Bass is sending a cord of wood. Fence down the south field.
It's a fire.
So when the church bells would sound, most people would grab their buckets from their homes and rush out and try and aid, because if a fire spread within that city, there's a good chance that your house could be taken with it. So there weren't really any firefighters back then on call to do these things. So we'll watch as this kind of escalates and see how the Boston Massacre unfolds, at least from this view.
My son. Murderers! Come away, Sam! Shoot me too, Preston. If you dare. Sam, come away! You'll suffer the full penalty of the law! Sam! These people need to be tended to. These people need our help here. Yes?
Okay, so you could tell from that video it was snowy outside. They tried to get the pump ready, and as he showed up on the scene, there were some younger individuals involved in what appeared to be the Boston Massacre, and you even saw perhaps one British official or soldier that had blood running down from his head from apparently some sort of being hit by some sort of item, whether it's snow, rocks, or a club. That will all be discovered later on. But this is going to kind of end up the video for right now, and we'll show another clip later on. This is part A of a series of clips that we'll look at for Chapter 7. Good luck.